Starbucks opened its first store in Seattle in 1971, and as we all know, in the nearly 50 years since, Starbucks has grown to be a global institution. And a big part of that success comes from thinking globally, but acting locally. From its supplier diversity program and partnerships with organizations that reflect its diversity and inclusion values, to calling employees partners. Starbucks lives its stated mission to inspire and nurture the human spirit, one person, one cup, and one neighborhood at a time.
Starbucks is successful for many reasons. There's probably quite a few of us in this room that could simply not live without, but that's really a prime example of the need for companies to go beyond their shores in order to spur growth and spark innovation. Our next two speakers illustrate this point clearly with their own cross-cultural experiences.
Oh my goodness.
Can I do this part, Nathan?
Yeah, where have you been?
I mean, you live in Vancouver. You must know how cute sea otters are. So
I do. Yeah.
I thought I'd see them for myself.
Okay, you do you.
You do you. I'm going to the aquarium. I'm not wearing that thing.
Well, speaking of the aquarium, it is Sea Otter Awareness Week.
It is
So,
Sea Otter Awareness Week.
Check it out while you're here.
We didn't plan that, by the way.
I just wanted to hold their little hands. You know how they hold hands so they don't slip away from each other?
I'm like, where? Oh, there it is. There's your little sea otter.
Our next speaker I have known for nearly 20 years, and that is because we actually went to high school together. But I've been familiar with where she works, the Seattle Aquarium, for much longer. Growing up, I was at the Seattle Aquarium almost every weekend, and up there with Starbucks, it is a Seattle institution in its own right. And a window to wonder that I'm excited to hear more about from the very talented Lindsay Holladay Van Damme. Also, thanks for the mask. Next, we'll go even further beyond our shores with Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gomez, whose 16 years commanding special ops teams and designing training scenarios in the U.S. military have parlayed into his work creating experiential learning programs for clients of all backgrounds through his own firm, First Person Experience. So first, please welcome my friend and marine science interpretive diver at the Seattle Aquarium, Lindsay Holladay Van Damme.
Oh, give it back. Oh, clicker.
Clicker.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. Thank you, Ian and Nathan, and all of the TEA staff that are involved in making this happen. I'm so happy to be here. I was also very grateful to hear the Honorable Cecile Hansen's land acknowledgement today, and how amazing that opening address from NEA. Thank you. I also want to acknowledge that we are gathering here on the ancestral land of the Coast Salish people, past and present, specifically the Duwamish tribe. My name is Lindsay. I am an educator at the Seattle Aquarium and diver, and I use she, her pronouns. I spend a lot of time underwater for my job, and when I'm in an exhibit, I wear a full face mask, like the one Ian was wearing, although my hair never looks that good when I take it off. It is very handy for being able to see and breathe underwater, probably most important. It's also great because there's an embedded microphone inside, and I wear headphones so I can communicate with the outside of the exhibit. That's all controlled by our dry side interpreter, and as a team, we are constantly engaging the audience and hoping to inspire conservation actions for our ocean. We do that through casual conversations as well as more formal presentations. A frequent interaction that we have noticed at the aquarium from visitors is we'll have the dry side outside the exhibit. A visitor will come up and say, "Is that a man in there?" And the dry side will say, "No." And they'll turn to their partner and they'll be like, "I told you, it was a robot." Yeah. So in addition to educating people about underwater life, we also kind of get to educate them about the diversity of scuba divers. There's an alternative to just men. I'm actually super honored to be part of a team made up mainly of women divers. We are all science divers, and we get to do research for the aquarium as well as our underwater education. Are there any scuba divers out here in the audience? All right, yeah. And I know Neha was also certified. Hopefully we inspire everyone to become certified after this. I mean, it's not for everyone, but I think it's a bit of a misnomer that we are divers, if you've ever thought about this, because as far as I know, the official definition of diving is to plunge head first into water. And I can say for certain, if any one of us were to dive head first, even into our largest exhibit at the aquarium, our dive safety officer would have serious words. Are there any dive safety officers out here? All right. When we enter the water as divers, it is a long process. There is no head first diving. This is quite sped up, but especially in cold water, it can take us 20 to 40 minutes to prepare for this cold water dives, and it ends up being about 100 pounds of gear that we're wearing. You can see all the underlayers to stay insulated in 45 to 50 degree water. Then you'll see all the dry suit layers as well as the dry hood. We put on full gloves. I get to wear a full face mask, so I'm literally 100% dry when I dive in our exhibits. That is, again, connected to the top. And anything additional like our dive computer and food bag as well. So it's a long process. Eventually, we get to kind of submerge, and oh, you're seeing the reverse process now too. And when we submerge, it's kind of that walking in. You know, there's no diving. You're like collapsing, leaning into the water, slowly going down. The word dive just sounds so much better, though, right? Imagine if I titled this talk "Lean into EduTainment." Yeah. It just doesn't have the same punch as dive in. So leaning is closer to what we're actually doing, and it is actually closer to what we do preparing for the work of communicating culturally responsive conservation for our audience members. It's a slow and thoughtful process that initially may go against some of those natural instincts. For example, our natural instincts as educators, communicators, entertainers, tells us to avoid the bad stuff, all those endangered species, the lack of salmon, millions of sharks dying, the plight of our killer whales. Hopefully you all met Granny outside. These are rough topics. Steer away from those heavy issues, our instincts say, the ocean acidification, rising sea level, depleted fisheries, and ultimately, above all, don't make your audience feel uncomfortable. And these are really good instincts for our industry where our livelihood depend on making sure that our visitors have a good experience. I suspect it might be different in an industry like the media, but for those of us regularly in front of an audience that want to transform their thoughts and actions, these are important instincts that we kind of have to lean into and move past. There are several trends in our field. Many of you have probably heard some of these trends in order to accomplish conservation without alienating our audience. One is to use more positive language. We rebrand global warming. So take global warming, we've rebranded it into climate change, and ultimately right now we're kind of moving into talking about it as climate resilience, more positive language. We now invite folks to be part of the solution rather than just pointing fingers and saying, look, you've created all these problems with your use of fossil fuels and now everything's dying. Let's be part of a solution. We can be heroes for our planet instead. So putting things into a positive light is a fantastic start to communicating conservation, but we can lean in a little bit further. Another trend is to tell the stories. By highlighting some of our success stories and the stories of animals, we can put a face on these tougher issues and bring them to a more emotional level. Thanks, Ian, for stealing my thunder with your sea otter photo. But this is Mishka specifically. We are celebrating her and all of our sea otters this week. Actually, globally, it is Sea Otter Awareness Week. Mishka, interestingly, has asthma. She was rescued as a pup and has been trained to use an inhaler here. And this is a really interesting story, just out of connection. I won't make you raise your hand if you have asthma, but you at least probably know someone who does. And it's a natural way to talk about climate change, since for her, her asthma gets worse during seasons where water or where air quality is low, and that is increasing as our climate is changing, and it can help us talk to people about how climate change affects wild populations. But what about animals that don't have faces? Literally, the sea cucumber does not have a face. And neither do the baby oysters or the baby sea urchins. And the diversity of life in our ocean demands that we empathize with animals beyond animals with cute furry faces. And that's because the faceless sea snails and baby oysters, they're the ones initially struggling with changes in our ocean chemistry from ocean acidification. It's our local sea stars, also no faces, but they are the ones who have experienced an unprecedented die-off in the past 5 years along the west coast, and that is possibly linked to rising water temperatures in our oceans. So, their stories have to be told if we're going to rally around these complicated environmental issues and come up with some diverse solutions. All right, so in addition to using positive language and telling stories, there are some other ways that we can engage in more culturally responsive conservation communication. We can be thoughtful about what specific words we're using and the metaphors that we're using as well. So, do most people really understand what we say when we say greenhouse gases, for example? Research would suggest that they don't. Do most people understand what we say when we mean sustainability? And that may look different for each one of our different specific fields. What about the idea of endangered? What does that really mean to folks? So thinking about these words and being really intentional about their usage is going to be important. And by spending time really digging in as a team, my team regularly reflects now on what we say, what we think we're saying, and then how that was perceived. That hopefully is showing our commitment to addressing this very issue. Our aim is to take time to craft really strong messages of hope for a diverse audience so that on the fly, as we sense that something needs to shift, we can pivot how we're saying something and have a whole toolbox of ways to talk about it. So for example, rather than talking about needing to recover watershed ecosystems for the whole salmon population, we instead can talk about we need to protect homes for baby salmon to be healthy and grow big. Rather than talking about all of the ocean acidification as massive chemical changes revolving around rampant carbon dioxide, we can talk about there aren't enough building blocks for young snails to build their shells. And in this way, we hopefully are able to engage a wider audience and a more inclusive audience. Another step we have to take if we are fully committed to culturally responsive conservation communication is to take a good hard look at ourselves and kind of think about what is making us uncomfortable. This is a good skill to develop if you are not sure what your own bias may be and you actually want to uncover your own bias. Keep your sensors alert for that pulsing little alarm that raises your hackles. Maybe it's a comment about age. Maybe it's something about affiliations that goes against everything that you kind of innately feel. Instead of giving in to that natural instinct to flee or fight when that beep, beep, beep alarm goes off in your head, lean into it, lean into the discomfort, and engage with it. This has taken a few forms for us as a dive team at Seattle Aquarium. We love costumes underwater. And over the years, especially during events, special events like Halloween and Christmas, we do love to either retrofit or create our own original, environmentally friendly costumes that will stand up to significant time under salt water. There's one in particular during our January event called Hawaii in our backyard. It is Hawaii themed. Historically, our divers, myself included, have donned costumes around grass skirts and leis. This past year, however, someone raised the question during the committee planning process that this may actually be inappropriate cultural appropriation. Ding, 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 ding. For a lot of us, those alarms were kind of going off, and we were thinking, that doesn't feel right. I mean, what does that? No. It's fun. It's harmless. The audience loves it. But instead of just pushing into those flight or fight responses, we did try to lean in and ask some questions and listen. We were able to then talk with our community. We were able to seek out appropriate folks from Hawaii. We did some more listening. We did a lot of listening. And ultimately, the committee as a whole decided, we really don't need this costume underwater to make a great experience for our visitors. And instead, we chose to invite a Native Hawaiian dancer and come teach a lesson to our audience. They were able to talk about the tradition, and it was a fantastic experience for everyone. Hopefully in that, we were able to make this a more inclusive environment and a great experience for everyone visiting the aquarium. So for those of you who are divers, I know there's a few of you, or for those of you who are snorkelers, or for those of you who can just imagine, I want you to imagine for a second that first breath that you have ever taken underwater. It's an unnatural and surreal phenomenon. We go against all of our natural instincts to take a breath into our lungs, despite the fact that our biology says it's wrong. With practice and repetition, that initial action really does become natural, and we're able to breathe in and out underwater without thinking about it. But that initial breath is really something else. Similarly, the skill of culturally responsive communication does get easier with time and practice. So I encourage us all to pay attention this weekend for those little triggers, those little beep, 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 that kind of, rather than turning away, I encourage us to lean in when we hear it and engage. If we become uncomfortable when we hear a land acknowledgement for Indigenous people, lean in. If we feel defensive that we defaulted to calling the scuba diver a he, or the sea urchin a he, lean in. If a person with terminal illness makes us feel squirmy, or a comment about age or ability feels like a slur, or the introduction of non-binary pronouns makes us feel awkward, lean in. It's only in that leaning in and keeping our eyes and ears open that we're able to sink beneath the surface into those deeper issues. In leaning in, we can get close enough to unpack what is it that's really going on here. It's only then that we can begin to explore the full richness of our diverse potential. Then we can change the world. And if that idea makes you uncomfortable, then I invite you to lean into that as well. Thank you.